Hey, friend, welcome back to the Lifestyle School podcast. I'm your host, Hope Plack, and today we're diving into a topic that sits at the center of almost every health conversation, whether people realize it or not. And that topic is inflammation. Today we're talking about inflammation. Now, inflammation has been one of those buzzwords that I think gets thrown around a lot, kind of constantly. And we hear people talk about anti-inflammatory diets, anti-inflammatory supplements, anti-inflammatory foods, lifestyles, etc. But what does that actually mean? What is inflammation? Why does it happen? Why is it connected to things like obesity, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune conditions, Alzheimer's disease, depression, chronic pain, and even cancer? And perhaps most importantly, why does nearly everything we focus on inside Lifestyle School, the podcast, and the course, Lifestyle School for Weight Loss, help lower inflammation? Today, I want to answer those questions because I truly believe that understanding inflammation helps make sense of so many of the struggles that people face along their health journey. And maybe you're trying to lose weight and nothing seems to work, or you find yourself exhausted all the time and your joints ache. Maybe your blood sugar is creeping up year over year, or maybe you feel like your body has been working against you. And while inflammation may not be the entire story, it is often a major piece of the puzzle. So, today, I want to start at the beginning and talk about what exactly inflammation is. And so, before we, though, get into the meat of today's topic of inflammation, I want to remind you, as always, that this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making any major changes to your diet, to your fasting routine, your supplements, your exercise, etc. And if you enjoy this episode, I'd love it if you'd share it with a friend, leave a review, subscribe to the channel, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. And then follow me over on Instagram and or Facebook at Hope Plack Coaching. I love to hear from you guys over there. I love to hear what you guys are thinking about in regards to your health journey. And also, if you have topics that you would love for me to cover on this podcast, please reach out and let me know, because I do love hearing from you guys in that regard. And then one last thing I do want to mention, if you are looking for a way to support the Lifestyle School podcast so I can continue to create free content for you guys, the easiest way to do that is not only to share the podcast, but if you are someone who currently buys supplements, or if you're looking for high quality supplements, you can now go over to my website, www.hopeplackcoaching.com. In the top right corner, there is a button that says store, and you can buy supplements from me. They're all third-party tested, professional grade products that I use for myself, I use for my kids, I recommend to my clients, and it's an easy way to support the show. If you do want to do that, the code to create an account is 104567. Again, that's 104567. I will put that in the show notes. If you've been thinking, I should probably add some things in to cover some gaps in my nutrition from a supplement perspective, but you're not sure where to start, go over and check out episode 43, where I go over my core 4 supplement recommendations and why they matter for metabolic health. So with that, guys, let's get into it. So, talking about inflammation, one of the biggest mistakes I think people make when viewing inflammation is that it's something bad. It's like we kind of went over this when we're talking about cortisol, when we're talking about insulin. I think these specific mechanisms in our body get demonized online because we have an oversimplistic view of them, right? But inflammation is not bad. In fact, if you had no ability to create inflammation, you would not survive very long. Imagine, you accidentally cut your finger while preparing dinner. Thankfully, I haven't done that for a hot minute because it's really annoying. But, immediately your body recognizes that the tissue is damaged on your finger, your blood vessels begin to dilate, and then your immune cells rush to the area. The repair mechanisms activate. Maybe you experience some redness, swelling, maybe there's some warmth or tenderness, and all of that you're experiencing in that moment is inflammation, right? It helps you heal. Or you can imagine you caught something like the flu, God forbid you got that, hopefully no one is sick currently listening to this because the flu is the absolute worst. But, your immune system creates inflammation to help fight off infection. You may develop something like a fever. You may feel achy or tired. Again, that is inflammation doing exactly what it was designed to do. Inflammation is like one of those sophisticated protective mechanisms that the human body has. Um, and truly, I think you can think about it as like your body's alarm system, right? It's a repair crew, it's the emergency response team. Without inflammation, you wouldn't recover from infections, you wouldn't heal wounds. Truly, you wouldn't survive some of the injuries that you experience. And so, what I want you to understand is that inflammation is not the problem that we're talking about today. The problem that we're talking about is chronic inflammation. Just like we don't want chronically elevated cortisol or chronically elevated insulin, we don't want chronically elevated inflammation. So hopefully you're like seeing this pattern here as we talk about these different topics, is that we have these mechanisms that are like supposed to be turned on and then turned off and then turned on and then turned off. But what has happened in our modern environment is that we flip that on switch and they never get flipped off. And this causes chronic problems within our health. And so think of acute inflammation like calling the fire department when your kitchen catches fire. Like they show up, they put out the fire, and then they leave. Chronic inflammation is like that fire department coming and permanently spraying water onto your house 24 hours a day. As you can imagine, at some point, the response to the fire becomes maybe more damaging than the fire itself. And long-term problems can happen, mold from the water damage. And that is exactly what's happening for so many people today when we're talking about something like inflammation or just, some of these other protective mechanisms in general that have gone awry within the systems of our body. And so one of the things that I find fascinating about the human body is that your immune system is constantly monitoring your environment. Every second of every day, your body is asking a simple question. And that question is, am I safe or am I under threat, right? And most people, I think of the immune system only responds to things like viruses and bacteria, but that's actually not true. Your immune system responds to anything that signals danger. And that danger might be a virus, it might be a bacterial infection, it could be a physical injury, but it could also be something like elevated blood sugar, damaged cells, poor sleep, psychological stress, right? Excess body fat, environmental toxins, poor nutrition, gut dysfunction. The immune system doesn't necessarily care where the threat comes from. It simply responds. And to do this, the immune system releases signaling molecules called cytokines. And you can think of cytokines as text messages sent between immune cells. Some cytokines tell the body, we need help over here. Others say things like, we've got this under control. And then others tell the body it's time to start repairing. And the problem arises when those inflammatory messages never stop. Instead of receiving an occasional alert, that immune system begins receiving constant notifications. And as you know, like even with your cell phone, if you're constantly blowing up with notifications, like that is not good, right? And maybe eventually you stop responding to them the same way, right? You create like a different relationship with those messages. And same things with inflammation is eventually inflammation becomes the background noise of daily life. And that is where chronic disease really begins to emerge and chronic health issues. And so I want to zoom out for a moment. If inflammation is such a major contributor to chronic disease, then an important question to ask becomes this: why are chronic diseases so much more common today, right? 100 years ago, people still got sick. They were still experiencing infections and injuries, but conditions like obesity, fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, autoimmune conditions were dramatically less common than they are today. And so the question then becomes like, what changed, right? And really, I think at the heart of it is that our environment changed, right? We think about the modern lifestyle. Most people spend the majority of their day sitting at a desk. Most people sleep less than previous generations. We're up super late into the evening scrolling on our phones, watching TV. We're exposed to artificial light late into the night via the TV and our phones, and even some of the lighting in our house. Many people, mostly eat ultra processed foods regularly. We snack from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to bed. We live with significant levels of chronic stress, right? So whether that be self-inflicted, right, via our life choices or like things in our life that we don't have control of, um, I think a combination of those have really increased the stresses that people experience. Not to say people didn't used to create stress. I think they definitely did, but I think maybe it was different, right? They weren't listening to podcasts, getting stressed about things. They were listening on a podcast. Um, but from an evolutionary perspective, I think this is a completely novel environment. The environment that people were living with 1,000 years ago isn't the same that it was 100 years ago, and so on. And I think our ancestors did experience periods of stress. However, I think a lot of times they were followed by recovery. I think there was periods of eating followed by periods of fasting, right? There wasn't a 7-Eleven on every corner or a Quick Trip for those of you listening in the Midwest. There was periods of activity followed by periods of rest. And, I think many people are stuck in this constant state of stimulation. This is something I've been thinking about in my own life, especially in relationship to my phone, which I'm constantly trying to have a healthier relationship with. But even, beyond the stimulation of our phones, we have the constant stimulation of eating, of stress, of exposure to information, right? To light, artificial light, I should say, specifically to processed foods. And unfortunately, all of these factors contribute on some level to inflammation. And so, this is one I think of the biggest mindset shifts that I try to teach my clients when it comes to talking about body fat. And that is that body fat is not simply stored energy, right? It's not just calories stored to be used at a later date. I think for many, many years, scientists thought that fat tissue was mostly inactive, just like a storage container. But now we know that that's completely false. Actually, our body fat is an endocrine organ, endocrine meaning hormone, and that means that it actively communicates with the rest of our body. And that becomes really important to understand, right? Because our fat cells release hormones, and fat cells also release signaling molecules. They influence things like our metabolism and our inflammation. And as fat cells grow larger, they become stressed. And you can think of it this way. Imagine trying to fit more and more people into a small room. Eventually, that room becomes like super crowded and uncomfortable. The ventilation becomes poor. Resources become limited. The stress increase. I think of it like an elevator is a really good a way of thinking about this, right? And then something similar happens within our fat tissue, right? As fat cells enlarge, blood supply becomes inadequate. Oxygen, delivery decreases. Immune cells begin infiltrating the tissue, inflammatory cytokines increase, and the body begins generating a chronic inflammatory response. And this is one of the reasons why having excess body fat and inflammation are so tightly connected, particularly abdominal fat, visceral fat, the fat that surrounds the organs, is especially inflammatory. I know we've talked about this on a previous podcast quite some time ago. And this is why, when we say waist circumference often tells us more about health risk than body weight alone, it's because of visceral fat. The more visceral fat we accumulate, the more inflammatory signals tend to occur. And unfortunately, inflammation itself makes it easier to store additional fat. So now, we have this vicious cycle of more fat creating more inflammation, and more inflammation worsening insulin resistance, and more insulin resistance promoting fat storage. And then, we're just like in this cycle that continues over and over and over again. And so if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've probably heard me talk about insulin resistance. And that's because I truly believe insulin resistance sits at the center of many modern health problems. Weight loss and the resistance to weight loss being, one of them, especially when such a high percentage of Americans specifically are metabolically unhealthy. So let's quickly review. Insulin's job is to help move glucose from the bloodstream into the cells, right? When cells become resistant to insulin's signal, the pancreas, which creates insulin, compensates by producing more insulin. And this creates a environment called hyperinsulinemia. So a lot like too much insulin, chronically elevated insulin over time. This contributes to things like weight gain, fat storage, blood sugar dysregulation, hormone disruption, and inflammation, which is what the topic for today. And what's interesting is that inflammation itself can worsen insulin resistance, and insulin resistance can worsen inflammation, right? So each condition feeds the other. And this is one reason that weight loss can often feel so difficult, is because, people are trying to lose weight while trapped inside this like biological cycle that actively encourages fat storage. So when we improve insulin sensitivity, we offer lower inflammation. And when we lower inflammation, insulin sensitivity often improves. And this is why I think improving metabolic health in general creates such widespread benefits throughout the body. I can't tell you how many times I have had clients, they come to me for weight loss and they start to lose weight, but they're like so shocked by the side effects the targeted approach I use for weight loss is lowering insulin so that your body can, and then creating space for your body to actually use that stored energy as fuel, in replace of actually eating fuel, and that is fasting. And they're always shocked by how this targeted approach is different than just calorie restriction, because they find that so many other symptoms that are usually connected to inflammation improve so rapidly and so noticeably. So another thing that I think is an important concept when we're talking about inflammation to understand and address is oxidative stress, which again, we've talked about on this podcast before. And I like to compare oxidative stress to rust. Right? You leave metal exposed to the elements long enough, it begins to rust. If you've ever owned a car in Minnesota, you know about this, right? From the changes of the seasons to all the salt on the roads in the winter for the ice, the same thing can happen inside the body. Every day your cells generate energy. Every day your body is exposed to things like toxins, stressors, environmental challenges. There is some degree of cellular damage, and that is totally normal, right? That's like the wear and tear of living. But when the damage exceeds the repair, that's when problems begin to develop. Things like high blood pressure increases oxidative stress. Things like poor sleep increases oxidative stress. Things like smoking, chronic stress, ultra-processed foods, oxidative stress, damages cells, and damaged cells activate inflammation, right? Inflammation then creates more oxidative stress, and another vicious cycle is born, right? So it's not just the insulin, it's the oxidative stress. And this is why health is rarely about fixing a single thing, right? Everything in your body is connected, and your body operates as this extraordinary, beautiful integrated system. And that's why we have to treat it and address it as such, right? And I think one of the most overlooked drivers of inflammation is stress. And I think when most people think about stress, they think about their emotions, maybe like the feelings of overwhelm, and maybe they feel like the feeling of being anxious or worried. But I think it's really important to always remember that stress is actually a biological event. And something recently, I had a client who did a couple weeks of a continuous glucose monitor, and this client was shocked by how stress affected their blood sugar. And I think I like on some level, I wish everyone could have a continuous glucose monitor for a couple weeks to just see how their body responds to the different things in their environment, because I think it's incredibly telling, not only from like a food perspective, but from a sleep perspective, from a stress perspective. Um, from an exercise perspective, because all of these things really dramatically affect our body. And I don't think a lot of times we think of it that way. And it results in us not taking as a holistic approach to weight loss and to like lifestyle change in our health, right? And so when it comes to stress, our body responds via the HPA axis. And we did just do an episode on this a couple weeks ago. So we have the hypothalamus for the H, the pituitary gland for the P, and the adrenal glands for the A. That is the HPA axis. And these systems release cortisol and adrenaline. And in the short term, this is incredibly helpful. Your body becomes alert, you're focused, you're ready for action. But the problem comes, of course, when the stress never ends, right? Your body was designed to survive emergencies. It was not designed to stay in emergency mode for years at a time or even weeks at a time, right? Stress becomes chronic, and so, sorry. When stress becomes chronic, that is when inflammation rises. And then, secondary to that, our blood sugar rises, our sleep suffers, our recovery declines, our cravings increase, our health begins to deteriorate. And, this is why stress management isn't like an optional part of the process of getting healthy and losing weight. It's physiologically necessary. And I know sometimes that feels easier said than done. I've been working with clients for a decade now, and you hear about all of the different ways that stress creeps into people's lives. Sometimes it's self-inflicted, but other times, like whether or not it's self-inflicted, there's like no way to get away from it. Whether that's like a family situation, like a work situation where you can't just like leave your job, right? You have to figure out your ways through that. It could be relational. And this is why I think it's so important to do the work to address stress. And, even simple things like praying, journaling, walking, taking time outdoors, calling a friend, reading scripture, these just aren't feel good activities. These actually help signal safety to the nervous system and hopefully gets you out of this stress loop. And with like the whole goal that, making your nervous system feel safe is going to help lower inflammation. And that brings me to sleep, right? We always bring it back to sleep on the podcast. If stress is the accelerator pedal for inflammation, sleep is the brake. Okay. Think of sleep as like that e-brake. Sleep is when repair happens. It's when growth hormone is released. It's when tissues recover. The immune system recalibrates when we sleep. The brain literally cleans itself through a process called the lymphatic system when we sleep. Sleep is when healing occurs, yet, many people treat sleep as it's like kind of optional, right? We wear sleep deprivation like this badge of honor, like, oh, I only got 5 hours of sleep last night. Oh, I was so bad, but truly, our body keeps the score, especially when it comes to sleep. And, even a few nights of inadequate sleep can increase your insulin resistance. Insulin resistance. I guess to be clearly here. Things like your hunger hormones can increase after a couple nights of sleep. Things like cortisol increase, your cravings, your inflammation. All of these, big things increase after just a few nights of inadequate sleep. So, in other words, poor sleep makes it harder to lose weight, harder to control your hunger, and harder to recover and heal. And so, if you want lower inflammation, better sleep is one of the highest return on investments you can make. And guys, here is the great news. Sleep is free, right? It's not like a supplement you have to go buy. It's not like some special meal plan you have to make. It's honestly, I feel like I've always been a big sleeper personally, like someone who just needs sleep. But I will say the older I've gotten and the more I've learned about health and the more I've just kind of tried to tune into what my body needs, and how I can honor my body in this act of recovering. And currently I'm on my own weight loss journey. I have really had to lean into sleep and be just I was like that chronic procrastinator when would come to going to bed. I would stay up late for like really no good reason, just dinking around, wasting time, scrolling on my phone, watching shows, whatever, reading a book. But I have just come to this realization that everything in my life is better from like my physical life to my emotional life, mental life, is better when I sleep, right? And it is the just like such a gift you can give to yourself. Put your phone down, turn off that light, and just close your eyes and go to sleep. Like, or just even lay there if you're not sleeping. Maybe take something like some L-theanine to calm you down if you have a hard time unwinding. But just going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time every day and getting that solid 8 hours is just, oh, it's chef's kiss. It is one of the best gifts you can give to yourself. So, sorry, I know I always harp on sleep, but you guys, I want you to be great sleepers who are just waking up every morning excited about your day because you feel refreshed and your body is working the way it was meant to because you gave it the sleep and the rest that it needs. Anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox. Moving on. Another major player when we're talking about inflammation is our gut, right? Hopefully that's not a surprise to you because roughly 70% of our immune system is associated with our digestive tract, 70 to 80%, based on what the most recent data is saying. And that means your gut and your immune system are in constant communication, right? When the gut is healthy, the immune system tends to function appropriately. But when the gut becomes dysfunctional, that's when things can really get off course and inflammation can often increase, right? Things like poor nutrition, chronic stress, alcohol, ultra processed foods, low fiber intake can all negatively affect our gut microbiome. The bacteria living within our digestive tract influence literally everything from immune function to our metabolism. And if you didn't know this, we have like 3 to 5 pounds of bacteria living in our gut, right? And we want that to be good, healthy bacteria. And this is one reason why I emphasize real food so heavily. And, it's not because there's any magical vegetable that's going to make you live 10 years longer necessarily, but it's because the foods that we eat help shape the environment inside of our gut, and the gut helps shape inflammation throughout the whole body, right? So I want to keep moving on and talking about how one of my favorite tools helps lower inflammation. And of course, that's fasting. Most people think of fasting and that it simply helps, reduce calorie intake because you're not eating. Hopefully, if you've been listening to the podcast, you're like, it lowers insulin. And so maybe based on what we previously just talked about, you're thinking like, oh, maybe there's this connection between fasting and lowering inflammation, right? Um, I hope you're making those connections and connecting the dot because when we fast, right, fasting is like the most direct way to lower our insulin levels. And when we lower our insulin levels, our blood sugar stabilizes, fat burning increases, and very often, not always, but very often, inflammatory pathways decrease, right? Because there is that inflammatory insulin cycle that happens. And perhaps most fascinating, which we haven't talked about yet, but maybe you've thought of it as we were talking about damaged cells, is that autophagy increases, right? And autophagy literally means self-eating, right? It's the body's cellular recycling system. Damaged proteins are removed via autophagy. Cellular debris is cleared away. Dysfunctional components are broken down and recycled. And you can think of it as like hiring a cleaning crew throughout your house. And that is happening on a cellular level during fasting. And that cleanup is going to lower inflammation, right? Because damaged cells trigger more inflammation, our immune system. And so when I talk about fasting as a tool, I truly, truly, truly want you to get this right because I think, even still, sometimes I don't talk about fasting anyone because it can be extremely triggering for some people, is what I have found. But if people are like asking me about stuff, I'll tell them that I do intermittent fasting. And then when I tell them that I fast for, 36, 42, 48 hours, they're like, it's very triggering for some people. And what I want people to know, though, and understand is that the goal with fasting is not starvation. I don't see it as that. I don't use it in that way. And I hope none of my clients or you listening think of it as that way, because that is so very far from the truth. The goal of fasting is repair. Like, this is a time for my body to repair its systems, to clean things up, to like utilize the stored fat that I have as energy, which is like the whole point of stored fat, right? Fasting creates this unique physiological environment that encourages the body to focus on maintenance and restoration. And, I think this is one of the many reasons why fasting often improves so many seemingly unrelated symptoms that people aren't expecting when they start fasting. And so everything, we've discussed today, I think leads us here. And I want to talk about it for a little bit. And so, and that is why does what we teach here in Lifestyle School, the podcast, as well as in my course, Lifestyle School for Weight Loss, work, right? Why does it work? Like, what's the common thread? Because every single component within what we talk about addresses inflammation. We focus on fasting, where we're lowering insulin, improving metabolic health. We focus on real food, and we're providing nutrients that support repair. That's going to lower inflammation. We focus on sleep, which is, this powerful recovery period. We focus on stress management, which is calming inflammatory signaling. And we focus on strength training and walking, and via those pathways, improving insulin sensitivity as well. And I just, I think it's really important to remember that every piece matters, every piece of the puzzle, right? Every piece works together in a specific way. And many people, they join Lifestyle School for Weight Loss because they want to lose weight. And that's great. That's a great reason to join. But the deeper goal, and kind of like my sneaky thing that, I love to see happen, is that the deeper goal is to truly create a healthier internal environment in their body. And weight loss often becomes a side effect of improving metabolic health. And improving metabolic health often means lower inflammation. And then all of these other side effects, from like aches and pains, like joint pain, to painful periods and PMS symptoms, to brain fog and fatigue, like all of these secondary symptoms are addressed, and it becomes more about like feeling so much better than it does even about losing weight. Like, weight becomes like that secondary bonus side effect that feels really good when you like get dressed in the morning and try to put a pair of jeans on that aren't stretchy. But like, showing up in your day and like actually feeling like an amazing human being that has energy and focus and is like excited to take on the day and can do the things that you've always dreamed about doing, like that is truly where the magic happens along this journey of health. And so, if there's one thing I want you to remember from today's episode, it's this, is that, inflammation is not the enemy, right? Inflammation is just information. It's your body's way of communicating that something needs attention. And the good news is that your body wants to heal, right? It's constantly moving towards balance when given the right conditions. And for that to happen, you don't have to do it perfectly. You don't need a miracle supplement. You don't need a complicated biohacking protocol or medication. All you need is consistent habits that support your biology, the way you were created day after day. The same habits that lower inflammation are the same habits that improve your metabolic health, that regulate your blood sugar, that improve your energy, that support your hormonal balance, and at the end of the day, make weight loss so much easier. And that's exactly what we focus on here in the Lifestyle School podcast, as well as in the course Lifestyle School for Weight Loss. If you haven't checked out my course, Lifestyle School for Weight Loss, you can do that over at my website, www.hopeplaquecoaching.com, where I really like take you through like the deep dive. There's a lot of common threads with what we talk about here on the podcast, but it really we really get into like the protocols of what you need to do to be able to lose weight. And alongside that, if you need one-on-one coaching, we can do that alongside the course. I find it so fun to work with my clients and just see them having these aha after aha after aha moments after years of, battling with their weight, kind of going back and forth through yo-yo diets and never truly like finding the way forward in a way that actually works. I think the thing that really makes I personally, so I've been in this diet, exercise, lifestyle, weight loss, personal training world for a long time. And I think what really sets what I do apart, which I feel very excited to be able to say, because I thought about this for a really long time, like what makes this different? How can I make my own impact on the world? And I think it's truly this is like, my goal is to help you understand how your body works so that you can make informed decisions about your health. And this doesn't mean you're gonna do it all perfectly, but when you make these different choices, whether you think it's gonna be a net positive or net negative, you understand what's happening inside your body so that you can go, okay, I did this. This is why I did it. We also get into like the emotional side of things as well, like understanding the root of, these behaviors, which is such an important piece of the puzzle. And that's why I love to talk about that piece on the podcast as well. But, having this understanding, this holistic approach of understanding all these different components so that, as we move forward, it's no longer this like white knuckle it for 6 weeks and lose the 15 pounds, the 20 pounds, and then go right back to what you were doing and have the same results. So anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent. But I want to say, you guys, thank you so much for being here, spending this time with me today. It really does mean the world to me. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone you love, leave a review, subscribe so you never miss an episode. And until next time, guys, take care of yourself. Remember that the small daily actions do truly create lasting transformation, and they matter even if you don't feel like it does in the moment. So with that, guys, we'll see you next week.